right, thank you very much. It's very, very exciting for me to be here. I have been coming to this conference on and off for the last 20 years. And I think, probably there's been a lot of retrospectives when you hit the 20th anniversary of anything. So I didn't do that. But I guess I should say something retrospective, which is I'm old now. And I guess when you get old, you get invited to be keynote speakers. Okay, no, seriously, a little bit about myself. When AID was getting started, 2004, around that time, I was like many of you, I was finishing up my PhD. And my PhD was in story generation. And I built a story generator, right? And it was a very symbolic system. And the one thing that I could kind of say that was the advancement of the time was we were able to look at, to generate with a theory of causality so that everything that happened in the story could be traced back to something previous in that story. What was going on behind the scenes was a symbolic classical partial order planner. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but we had discrete events and we had these causal relationships that tracked changes in the state of the world. So we can look at how all the different symbols were able to change through time. And we were able to do that because we had handwritten symbolic knowledge, preconditions and effects for all those sorts of things. And I was pretty happy and pretty excited about that. And I don't think I was at the first couple of workshops that preceded this, but if I had been, I would have been talking about interactive narrative. What happens when a player prevents a story from causally continuing, right? So you have a particular story you want to tell, maybe it's Little Red Riding Hood, maybe it's something else. And the user comes along and says, well, I'm going to screw up your story. I'm going to do something like, I'm going to kill the wolf before he can carry out his grand plan to kill the grandmother, right? In which case I had a story generator. So we'll just say, well, if that happens, I can go and generate some more story stuff, right? And I could also say, well, what happens if something else happened that intervenes in the story that causes the causal impossibility to go on? Well, I can generate another possible story. And I can kind of do this recursively, looking at all the different possible stories I can generate. And we ended up generating something that really kind of looks like choose your own adventure at this point. And we could do this in advance, so we could run in real time. And it was a pretty fun sort of thing to do. Now, we called this interactive storytelling or interactive drama, things like that. But what we were really thinking about in our heads was, this is really a lot of what dungeon masters do in role-playing. You have an interactive narrative. You have to respond to players dynamically because your players have their own free will, the ability to do whatever they want. So you had to have an AI system that could not only generate stories, but adapt those stories, change those stories in real time. Probably had to think about the goals and structure of storytelling. Just anything wouldn't do, but you had to drive a story forward to some particularly interesting way for your players. You had to deal with non-player characters, so you had to be able to not just talk about stories, but talk about characters at the character level. Maybe you wanted to model the preferences of your players to know, well, there are certain stories that will be more favorable to the people that are in the room with me as my players and me as the dungeon master. And that was all. So these are some of the kind of the big challenges that we were facing when it comes to building a dungeon master circa 2024. Then the world changed and large language models came along. But really, this is the pay attention to Laura Martin slide, because 2018 or so, she started writing about large language models to build dungeon masters. And in 2020, the Wired magazine kind of picked up some of her work, presented that with this nice thing about how D&D needs to be the next challenge beyond Go and chess and checkers and things like that. And this talk is not going to be about dungeon masters. I'm so sorry. I know everyone is like, Dungeons and Dragons, we're going to build dungeon masters. I'm going to talk about something else about Dungeons and Dragons. I'm going to talk about players. But if you really want to think about dungeon masters, you should go and read Laura's subsequent works that she's been working on the past few years, and then talk to her after this. So I'm going to talk about why we should build players. the people who play the games driven by the dungeon masters. All right, think about humans and AI players going through missions, campaigns, stories together. So I'm going to try to convince you that as cool as dungeon masters are, and we should definitely do dungeon masters, we should not forget about the AI of players. And I'm going to try to kind of explain why I think doing this is going to let us tackle some of the big challenges that have kind of been with us in AI since the 1970s, really. Okay, so let's get into it. Only old people will understand some of this stuff. All right. Now, probably at this point, I'm assuming most of you have at least heard of Dungeons and Dragons, and hopefully not just because I've said it about 10 times in the last 5 minutes. But let's kind of talk a little bit about why I think Dungeons and Dragons role-playing games in general are interesting, and let's set some ground about what I'm going to be talking about, the important things for this talk. And if you've seen Stranger Things, that's the premise, right? Or maybe you watch Critical Role or something like that, or maybe you don't. Maybe you just have friends who talk about it. All right, so when you're a player in Dungeons and Dragons or any role-playing game, you assume some sort of fictional identity, and you describe through words what you're trying to do. Now, while the screen has some props here, little buildings and characters, it's typically not played like this. It's typically played entirely through language. Yeah, right. So there may be props, there might be dice. I'm not going to talk about the dice part, right? The combat parts either. I think we know how to model combat sorts of things. What I'm really kind of focused on is the role playing, not the die rolling of games. Okay. Now, as you're explaining what your characters are doing, there are rules. They do constrain some of the behavior. Generally, it's common sense things like, unless you're a magic user, you can't teleport yourself, you can't just do anything you want. You have to do things more or less like you do in the real world, but maybe with some fantasy elements layered on top. Now, as you're trying to decide what to do and deciding what to do, the dungeon master is there. What does the dungeon master do? You can think of them as the arbiter of truth. So anytime some sort of judgment has to be placed as to whether the thing you want to do happens or how it changes the world, the dungeon master is the one who does that. They're also going to introduce additional elements like non-player characters and things like that to keep the story going. Okay, and then most importantly, hats are in fact optional. All right, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of idea, but really it's a bunch of people pretending to be other people, talking to each other about what they would do if they were those real people in some weird circumstance, and seeing what happens next. And the dungeon master is often telling you what happens next. Okay, so why am I so interested in the players of role-playing games from an AI perspective? And I think to answer that, we should look at non-role-playing games first. Okay, now games have been a huge driver of artificial intelligence progress, especially in the past 5 years, but really over the last 20. And we have seen amazing things happen with game-playing agents in a variety of different games. And this is some examples of some of the games that you've probably seen amazing papers and progress about, right? But I also want to say that as much as these have been drivers of progress, they also don't do everything that I think we want to do in AI. So for example, most of these games are finite. And if they're not finite, they're regular. Like in StarCraft, you know what a tank looks like, and the tank always looks like a tank, right? So even though they might have large state spaces, they're very regular, they're very predictable. They have relatively small action sets. You might think, well, there's a lot of actions in StarCraft, 50 or 100. I'm going to say we'll discover that that's actually a small number when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons. Most of these games you can play pretty reactively. You don't actually really have to think too far in ahead. Not true for all of these. Go, you have to think long term. But in lots of these video games, you can be fast twitch and do really, really well. You get some partial observability, but it's very limited in terms of the partial observability. A lot of what you need to do and know is actually on the screen or available in some other way. Go, everything is on the screen for you. StarCraft, most everything that's relevant to what's going on right now is on the screen, or you can move the screen wherever you need to look. All these games have a definitive game state, and a win condition, right? We know what it looks like to win Go. We know what it looks like to win StarCraft, and we can design reward functions and scoring functions around those things. So we know from a moment-to-moment basis often how well we're doing. There isn't communication between the AI and the humans. These are usually the AI playing against a human. Now, diplomacy in the last couple of years has started to introduce some human teaming and human communication, but by and large, this has been ignored in the gaming space. And so what does Dungeons and Dragons as a player bring to this? Well, first of all, you have to understand language. And a few years ago, that was hard. Now it's a little bit easier, but not totally solved. You enact change in the world through language. And by extension, you probably have to do planning in language space. What does it mean to do planning in language space? That's kind of a question that we'll be looking at. Your state space is technically infinite because you can do virtually anything you want. There's some constraints, but most dungeon masters will let you go and do lots and lots of things, even if they're not relevant to the story. That also means there's an infinite action set. In terms of the actions I say, which is just a sentence, right? There's virtually an infinite number of sentences I can say at any given time, which might change the world. There is no single ground truth world state. There's no game state. There's no game simulation image that engine that says this is what's true and this is what's false. Matter of fact, all the players might not even agree what the ground truth is going on in terms of the game. We'll talk about that in a second. It's open-ended. So while the Dungeon Master might have a quest for you to go on, you don't actually have to go on it. Other things might happen. You might change your goals throughout time. All right. Communication, obviously, it's team play. You don't play Dungeons & Dragons by yourself. Unless you're me and you just don't have any friends and you're just very, very sad all the time. When you have an AI that's playing with humans, of course, what the agent is doing has to make sense. The other players have to say, like, should not be always constantly saying, what the hell are you doing? Right? I should understand what you're doing. I should understand you as if you're another human. So you should have very human-like play. Okay. And this is what really kind of gets me excited about Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing in particular, is this lack of a single ground truth. Okay, so we can imagine a bunch of people playing a role-playing game, and maybe they have entered a tavern, right? But maybe they have very different ideas of what their tavern is and what tavern they look like. Maybe one thinks they're in a wooden tavern, one thinks they're in a stone tavern, and maybe this doesn't really matter. This is not a detail that really matters until one of them says, oh, there's a bunch of bad guys here, let's lock them in and burn down the tavern. And then you've got this guy over here saying, what? How could you burn down a stone tavern? Oh, I think we're in slightly different worlds here. We need to update our mental models to get ourselves the correct details that we can all agree upon and share upon. Right? So there's some sort of mental state revision that's constantly happening as we listen to each other in terms of reconciling each individual person's ground truth of what's actually going on in the game. And the Dungeon Master can help if absolutely necessary. Okay, so if we get all scientific about this, what we're saying is that we're dealing with shared experience. Okay, we live in worlds that are governed by some laws. A lot of those laws involve cause and effect, like you burn something down and you expect it to actually burn. We also live in a world that's governed by social contracts in terms of behavior. And we can kind of build a little diagram to kind of explain the interaction loop in a role-playing game or any interactive person-to-person experience. All right, so someone makes an utterance that goes into someone's mind. They build a model based of the world based on what they think that utterance it does relevant to the world. They manipulate, they think about the world, they choose an action or perform another utterance. And this only works if everybody is able to go through the same process, where someone else is also thinking about the utterance, also building a mental model of the world, and manipulating the world to make their own choices. And this doesn't work at all unless there's some similarity. They don't have to be exact, as we just said, but there has to be some similarity between these two mental models. And what's really kind of phenomenal and amazing, if you really think about this, is that this happens. This actually works. Why does this work? Well, let me get into why this works, but really we turn this into a loop to say as one person makes an action or an utterance, then it goes into the other players who then act on that. You might be thinking that, this sounds like common sense reasoning. That's actually the wrong word. I actually prefer a word called common knowledge, or really actually shared knowledge. And the fact is that there are facts about the world that when we come from the same society, the same culture, we tend to agree upon. These are things like facts about the world, like fire burns wood. It does include common sense, like you really shouldn't touch hot things, or things that are glowing red. It involves social conventions, like what's the proper way of queuing at an airport. Very different if you're in one country or another country. These are very socio-culturally specific, right? Or what is the proper way of actually going through the procedure of a wedding, right? Which can vary from religion to religion. And trope knowledge as well, because we're dealing with fantasy, right? Knowing things that most people agree upon, which is like silver bullets kill werewolves, right? So these are all things that we all can draw upon, and many, many more, when we're building out our mental models. And if we're drawing upon approximately similar knowledge, we tend to build similar models. Okay. Now, here's where I disappoint you, which is that most of my talk will not be about role-playing games, because they're hard for all the reasons we just talked about, and we're not quite there. There's one thing I ever kind of learned from my own advisor was you always walk before you run. So let's start with something a little bit easier that is also really hard, and these are text adventure games. Okay, text adventure games have game engines. They have ground truth worlds, but they are language games. So we are dealing with some of the aspects that we want to deal with, and then later we'll try to drop some of our hand holding and try to go to the harder problem of full role-playing games. But let me talk a little bit about text adventure games as the first step to role-playing games. They are language games, and that's the most important thing we want to deal with. You've either heard of Zork, or you've played Zork, or your grandparents said, I remember the days, something along the lines. If you haven't, they're really fascinating, but they're games with no graphics, right? Everything that you do is described to you in text, and everything that you do is typing in text, right? So to give you a very simple example, if you start to play a game like Zork, is the first thing you see is just a line of text, right? You're standing in an open field west of the White House. There's a small mailbox here, and you have to do something, right? So you can type in lots and lots of different possibilities. They don't all do something, but a lot of them do. You can open the mailbox, in which you get new text describing how the consequences of your action. These are often spatial, so you can go in different directions, north, south, east, west. And when you do, you get descriptions of how the world changes. It's not all about just moving around. There are non-obvious actions or subtle actions, or things that you don't often see in regular computer games, video games, like open the window. It might actually open. You might actually have to crawl through a window, right, to make progress in the game. Okay, so to play this game, you have to understand that these small snippets have important consequences for the state of the world, but you never get to see the true state of the world. So text adventure games are hard. I don't think anyone has really fully solved Zork in a way that I think is 100% satisfactory. One of the reasons why just language games themselves, like text adventure games, are hard is, first of all, they bring in partial observability. Okay, so you only get information about your current location, the room you're in, quote unquote. They have hundreds of locations, hundreds of objects, hundreds of other entities, and they all have unique descriptions. So first of all, you really have to understand that language to understand what's going on in the world. We call this textual SLAM. SLAM comes from robotics, simultaneous location and movement. But basically, you must learn a map while you're reading and moving around. The bigger issue, though, I think, is the combinatorial state action space. Now, these parsers in the game engines, they can take up to 4 words at a time. 4 words. Very, very exciting. And they might only have a vocab. They might actually only understand 700 words. Right? But that means in any particular state that you're in, what is this? 10,000 million, 240 billion possible actions that you can perform. Most of it's gibberish. Most of it doesn't make sense. And even the ones that do make sense don't actually do anything particularly useful. But if you're a naive agent, you can't brute force your way through this. You're not going to A-star your way through this without some cheating. Okay. Now, common knowledge is going to be important in dealing with that combinatorial problem. So how do you effectively interact with these objects and locations? Okay, well, you're going to do affordance extraction. Given an object, what is a reasonable verb and a reasonable object to do it on, right? There's a big difference between opening a mailbox and eating a mailbox. And pre-GPT, this was hard. Now it's gotten a little bit easier. GPT at least understands that eating mailboxes is not a typical sort of thing, but sometimes it is, right? Sometimes you have to do something a little bit unusual, like stab a vampire with a stake. Did I get the right stake? Okay. But as I mentioned, like, sometimes you really have to do things that are not like probabilistic. Like, well, let's make a ladder out of some vines because that's the only way to make progress. Most of these games are puzzle games, which means you do have to solve problems in particular orders. You can think of them as a series of locks and keys. Metaphorically, there are things you have to do before you're allowed to go to new places, sometimes literal. You have to find a key and open a door. And that means you often have long causal dependencies. So something you do early in the game has importance later in the game. For example, early on in Zork, you have to pick up a lamp because you have to light it in a dark place, and if not, you get eaten by a monster called the group. So you have to be able to reason about long causal dependencies, which, as we all know, are a historical weakness of large language models and many other techniques we have. Even reinforcement learners have problems with these things. Okay, now we are going to approach these problems as reinforcement learning problems, and in particular, deep reinforcement learning problems. And I'm not going to assume that everyone knows reinforcement learning or deep reinforcement learning. So I'll tell you kind of what you need to know. First of all, a deep reinforcement learner is going to learn something called a policy. What is a policy? Here's a bunch of math stuff, but it basically means that it's able to guess the best action given the state you're in. Now, of course, in a game like this, you don't really know what state you're in, so that's a little bit of a difficulty. The way you learn how to do this, though, is you can do a lot of trial and error. You can play the game lots and lots of times and see what works and what doesn't work. There's kind of two technologies that are worth mentioning. First of all, the DeepQ network, which I'm not going to talk about at all. I only use that to make the joke about the title, Dungeons and DQNs, just because it sounds like Dungeons and Dragons. Laura Martin, again, was the genius that came up with that joke. You might not think it's funny. I think it's funny. But really, this is like the old way of doing reinforcement learning. Now we have something called the actor critic. Again, just so you know what an actor critic is, just so I can talk about a few things. Again, you might not be into deep neural networks. You might not be into reinforcement learning. What an actor critic network does is it tries to play a game in kind of two stages. One is it takes the state of the world, an observation, whatever's going on the screen, and encodes it, which just means smush it into a bunch of numbers. And if it gets those numbers right, it can decode it into an action, maybe a set of words, like go north, or open the window, or something like that. They also learn, have a weird thing going on with the clicker here. They also learn to predict how good the state is that they're transitioning to. Not important for the rest of the talk. The important thing is I'm going to draw diagrams like this that says squish things into numbers and then make actions out of them. That's all you really need. That's all reinforcement learning does. That's all you need to know. Okay, so we're going to make reinforcement learners play text games. It doesn't really kind of work. If you do what I did on the previous screen, it doesn't actually work particularly well. We need some secret sauce. The secret sauce is we're going to look at how humans play text adventure games, and these are really, really hard. They're cognitively demanding. So most people that play these games, they map them out. They write things down on paper. Okay. The computer science equivalent of this is something called the knowledge graph. Right. So think of it as all the facts that you need to keep track of and the relationships between other facts and other pieces of information. You can look at it as a graph, but it's really just a list of triples of subject, relation, object. I am in the house. There's a path to my left. I have an egg. The egg is openable, things like that. All right. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do reinforcement learning. We're going to use a knowledge graph. Our knowledge graph becomes an external information. All right, external memory. So this knowledge graph, as we build up over time, contains a lot of the information that is hidden from us that we uncover. And instead of keeping it hidden, we just kind of throw it into one big repository and say, all right, I can now always refer back to things that I can no longer see. Okay, so if we put this back into the model that I talked about from role-playing games, right? We play games basically like we play role-playing games. Okay, we see a game description, we model it, and this time our model is a knowledge graph. We manipulate that knowledge through a reinforcement learning, deep reinforcement learner that looks very similar to what we just drew before, smushing it as numbers, expanding it out into actions. We put those actions into the game and then something happens. Okay, so for those of you who like big fancy architectures, this is what's really going on behind the scenes in terms of some of the most successful reinforcement learners that play language games. We know the actor critic. What we start out with is some observations, some descriptions that we're getting, the text of the world. We're going to run this through a version of large language model called BERT. Actually, Albert QA doesn't really matter. It's just a version of BERT. We get it to ask a bunch of questions like, where am I? What am I doing? What's here? What's relevant to me? By answering those questions, we're able to extract the entities and the relationships that we need to add to our knowledge graph. So we're building up our knowledge about the world, and then we can encode that in a fancy way to choose our next action. Okay, and we can also look at the words too, just in case we miss some information. All right, so big fancy architecture graph like this to get to be able to understand and play the game. Okay, now you might ask, like, how does this work? Where is the grounding, right? What does this have to do with what's actually going on in the game? There's something kind of interesting happening here. First of all, BERT, as we know from any large language model, are trained in an ungrounded way. They never make reference to the real world. What we're doing, though, by asking questions about what we're seeing and by putting them into graph form, we're forcing the agent to put the knowledge that it's extracting from the world into the context of other facts that have already been extracted from the world. So we are pseudo-grounding it, right? We're getting as close to grounding as we actually can by breaking it down into these basically discrete pieces of knowledge. And the nice thing about BERT is it's actually has a lot of common sense, and any large language model has a lot of common sense and common knowledge. Right? They know what happens if you see a tree. They know what you can do with a tree. They know what you can do with a window. Okay, so does it work? Yeah, our graph goes higher than the other graph, so we're pretty happy about that. This is not a results-oriented talk. Okay, why does it work? Well, it's because large language models actually have a fair amount of shared knowledge, shared understanding, and it's actually very similar to our understanding of the world because they learn from us. They learn from our data, right? And in particular, they can infer lots of missing things. So if you look at these observations, right, they're not totally complete. They don't tell you everything that's going on in the world. They let the reader, the player, infer lots of things, and from those inferences, they decide what to do. The only thing that's different from a large language model just trying to play a game is we wrap it in the reinforcement learning loop, which lets us explore and decide whether certain sentences are better for gameplay than others. Matter of fact, we know that this is what's happening because we can get these things to play shared knowledge games. So there's a particular game that I'm very passionate about called 905. It's what's called a slice of life game. And what's important here is the first part of the game, the first half of the game, is how to get out of bed and go to work. It's a very, very exciting game. If you don't get enough getting out of bed and going to work, you can play this game and get more of it. But more importantly, the AI has to demonstrate that it knows some really kind of basics about human life. Like, how do you make coffee? How do you find your keys? How do you take a shower, right? And here's what we do, right? We go into this game and we say, I'm going to take out certain keywords like the shower, the coffee pot. I'm going to make it so that if you don't understand that the shower's in the bathroom and you can't leave the house till you take a shower, which, by the way, is a very important rule that you should all know about, you can't make progress in this game. So if we say there's no shower, can you still figure out how to take a shower? Okay. And it turns out with these large language models in the training loop, even simple ones like BERT, we're able to do well, whereas most other baselines just get stuck very, very quick. All right. Now that I've bored you with text adventure games where we have a game engine that has a ground truth that helps you walk through the game, let's now try to relax these constraints and try to go to something that looks a little bit more like a role-playing game. These will be text, so we will talk, read, and write. We won't do speech, so we'll still keep that simplifying assumption, but I think we'll get a little bit closer. All right. So what makes role-playing games interesting now that we've been through text adventure games? A few things. First of all, it is team-based and it is collaborative. So most text adventure games are single player and do not have real other characters. So we bring that in. We're actually not going to do too much with that in this talk. Players have personas. You don't need that to play Zork. These games, role-playing games, you are expected to be in character. They give you abilities, special abilities based on what kind of character you are, but it also kind of constrains what you're doing. So if you're a particular role, if you're a cleric, you should act cleric-y, right? If you're a thief, you should act thiefy. And it would look really weird if your thief starts acting like a cleric, right? So it kind of creates some implicit constraints on what characters do. There could be quests or missions. They're typically provided during gameplay, so you don't know what the win condition is before you start, which means you cannot train in advance to win a game because there is no win condition until you start playing the game and you get told the win condition. Or you don't even get told the win condition. You basically say, something happened. What do you do? And importantly, and the reason for this meme is there's no reward signal. There's no score, really. You can't just figure things out by looking at which actions make your score go up or make you get closer to the end of the goal, right? These are the problems that really kind of are going to have to change how we're going to work on the problems. These last two in particular, but all of them provide additional elements worth consideration. So here are some of the research questions that we're going to have to answer to be able to play a game like this. How do you train a virtual role-playing agent without extrinsic reward, without this reward signal? How can you do anything? Reinforcement learning, everything kind of requires rewards or goals, and you just don't have them. How do we condition the agent's behavior on goals delivered at execution time? You're playing the game and you get a new goal all of a sudden. How can you change to that goal? How do you interleave dialogue and action? Right, so now we're playing with other characters. It's not just about do this, open the window, move left, move right. You're also talking in character as well. So you have to be able to do that too. How do we train an agent to perform actions that are in character? Okay, so how do we kind of constrain it to these different personas so that people feel good, like, yeah, you're definitely in character versus you're breaking character, which is unsatisfying. How do you deal with not having any sort of ground truth in the game whatsoever? So playing text adventure games, we can try different actions and the game engine might say, I'm sorry, you can't do that. That's a really useful piece of information. If nothing is saying, or very rarely being saying, you can't do that, that makes things really, really hard to figure out whether you're making any sort of change in the world and therefore making any sort of progress. All right, so we're going to look at a few of these through the talk, not all of them. And really what I'm going to say here is not that any of these are solved, but these are hints about how we might be able to move forward on all of these problems. And then I'm going to leave it all up to you young people to hopefully come in and fill in all the details. Okay, so the first problem being, how do we deal without extrinsic reward? How do we deal without having a reward signal to work with? So some of my students and I have been working on a particular attempt to do this. And here's the problem, right? If you don't have extrinsic reward, you need something else, another objective function. Well, if it's not extrinsic, intrinsic? Okay. There's actually a lot of ways of getting intrinsic reward. If you look at the literature, one of the most common ones is learning from demonstration. Get a human to demonstrate what you do in that world and then try to kind of infer what motivates that person. Try to infer the reward from what humans actually do. That doesn't generalize well, and it means you have to actually have humans go in and play the game for you, and then you try to learn how to play the game by watching them play the game. Sometimes it's called behavior cloning as well. You don't always have this data, and it's hard to get. So our alternative is, well, maybe you don't need actual demonstrations. Maybe what you need in a role-playing game is a bunch of stories about fictional characters doing similar sorts of things. And maybe we have an agent that can read those stories and try to infer why those characters are doing those things. Now, stories are really easy to get. I can scrape them from the internet. They're actually already in our language models, which have already scraped the internet for us. And we might be able to make these abstract and generalize enough from them because we can get lots of these stories. Okay, so all we really have to do is take stories and now convert them into some sort of rich, dense reward signal. It doesn't come from the environment, it comes from the stories instead. And if we can do that, we should be able to motivate our characters, our agents, to act in a consistent way with those stories. Okay, so how do we get reward information from stories? Well, I'm going to fall back on my favorite thing, which is turning things into knowledge graphs. If we can turn stories into knowledge graphs, then what we can do is we can say, make the world look like these graphs. Okay, so what do I mean by turning stories into knowledge graphs? We can take a very simple sentence that doesn't have a whole lot of information, like I drove to the beach. We can get information from that in terms of entities like me, the beach, and probably a car, right? Driving should imply that. But I can actually go further and I can say, what else do most people really understand about this sentence that isn't actually written down? Like the fact that beaches have sand may or may not be important. Beaches tend to be sunny. Might be wearing a swimsuit if I'm going to the beach. We don't know if these things are true, but they're very, very likely to be true. Very possible. This gives us the ability to think beyond an actual sentence. And now that we can do that, we can start to describe a story that we read in terms of knowledge graph state change. Okay, so our intrinsic reward is now, can we make the agent's internal knowledge graph, because remember it's building its own model of the world, look like the knowledge graph that comes from a story. And this can be robust to environment level variation. So if I don't have a car, maybe I can find my other way to get a beach, but I need to see a beach in my world state to feel like I'm making progress. Okay, so this is what this looks like. This is the same architecture as before, just drawn a little bit slightly differently. We take a story, we turn it into a knowledge graph by stepping through the story, looking at all the different world state knowledge that we can extract from that. Meanwhile, our agent is playing the game. It's building its own knowledge graph. And what we're doing now is we're saying, can you make one graph look like the other graph? If they don't look like the same, we have to keep working. The more we add to our graph that looks like the graph on this side, whatever the side this is, my left, your right, that means we're making progress. And now we are rewarding ourselves for making graphs match to each other, which we can use to update our own understanding of how to play the game. All right, and this works. We ask people, does this agent play more like particular characters? We give it stories about thieves. We give it stories about adventurers, bums, thugs. And we say, in most cases, these agents play more like what you'd expect from these tropes than other things. All right. Now, what I think is actually particularly exciting about this is not just about personas. This is not just about role-playing games. We can do something called normative alignment. We can look at value alignment. All right, so we know that agents are safer when they conform to our expectations, when they participate in our world according to the human's rules. Okay, and that means we can get them also to play games like 905 or games about seeing doctors or going shopping. Okay, what do I mean by value alignment or normative alignment here? Well, here's what a reinforcement learner will do in a world in which you go shopping. Okay, seems reasonable. You go to the mall and you take some clothes. Now, probably there's some steps missing. If I put a large language model into it and I asked it to do the same thing, it does add an extra step. It realizes that, hey, you should actually use money before you take the clothes. Another important life tip for you all, hey, before you leave the store. Okay, now this is better, right? This is an agent that is following the rules of society without being told about the rules. It is part of its shared experience. That it has figured out. But I would actually kind of say that, and this is how I shop, right? And my wife says, no, that's really not how you're supposed to shop. Wow, no. My wife says this is a better plan. All right. Like maybe you should actually try on your clothes before you buy them. Saves you a whole lot of trouble, turns out. Another pro tip. We learn a lot of things from AI here today. All right. So when we have story shaping, if I tell it a bunch of stories about how people tend to go to malls, right, it starts to extract additional information and additional steps that we would kind of consider as more normative, more realistic. At least, unless you're a dude. All right. Okay, and now we can test this as well. And just to kind of break this bunch of mad numbers down, when we get baseline agents, they do actions that fewer people think are following social conventions. Our agent does things that more follow social conventions. And when we ask people, what was this saying, right? So people tend to think that these agents look more human-like. They meet their expectations more than other agents. Okay, so we have agents that are actually kind of better at participating in society when we throw away the fantasy things. So this is not actually about fantasy games. It doesn't have to be. It's about the real world as well. Because don't we all just role play through our real worlds? Maybe. Kaufman has something to say about that. Okay, so let's jump back to the research questions. What else do we have? Let's do this one. How about when agents don't know their goals in advance? What can we do about those things? Oh, wait, what? Oh, what's going on? Oh, shit. All right. I think I need to speed up. All right. I'm going to go through some of these fast. Goal conditioned agents. All right. If a goal is given an execution time, what are you going to do about that? Well, here's a pretty straightforward thing to do. Just add some sort of prompt about your quest to the agent. Your goal is to get the magic lamp, and you are standing next to a wall in front of a house. You've entered the house. Your goal is still to get the magic lamp. You add that to the information. Maybe it conditions the agent, if it's an LLM-based agent particularly, what the next thing is going to do. It's at least going to change the behavior. But before you have to do that, you're going to have to train it to understand those prompts. So you're going to have to go train on a bunch of example quests. And this seems pretty straightforward, but there's actually, you're going to run into a problem. If you do this, you're going to find that most of the quest data, and as you try to do it on lots of different quests that you might have data for or stories, you're going to find a highly skewed data sets. Like lots and lots of quests out there are about getting things for the king, or hitting dragons, or things like that. That means there's a lot of different quests for which you're not going to have very much data. And if your data is skewed like this, you're going to learn a few quests really, really well. And then lots of quests you're not going to know what to do. So they're going to say, why don't you go befriend the peasant? And you're going to say, I'm going to go hit the dragon. Okay. So this is just a matter, this is a machine learning thing. This is just what happens when you have highly skewed, highly biased data. Leads to poor generalization, and deep reinforcement learning is particularly very susceptible to this because they love to memorize activities. Okay, so not going to go into a lot of detail, but it turns out you get a procedural content generator, a quest generator. I hear that this conference likes procedural content generation. Throw this in here, generate new synthetic data of possible quests. You can change the skew. You can balance the skew, and then you can walk them through lots of these quests, knowing that you're going to see an equal number of plausible quests in equal proportions. And you can do something called curriculum learning to make your quests more complicated over time, to help them walk to bigger and longer sorts of things. And this works. Okay. All right. We haven't said anything about other characters, other players. We talk about doing things, right? We also talk to players. How am I doing on time? Are you the Gru? Oh, perfect. Okay. All right. So turns out that if you're playing games, you're actually going to want to talk to either humans or other agents. So your dialogue is going to look like this. Right? You're going to say something, an agent pretending to be a dragon is going to say something, or vice versa. You might be whatever it happens to be. But either way, as you say in character things like, I am going to eat you for stealing my treasure. If you're a dragon, you're also going to do other things like, you know, hit knight, right? Or do actions, right? So you're going to interleave your dialogue with other words that are actually about action, right? So how do we move back and forth between dialogue and action? Well, one way of doing this, which I think is a hint of interesting things to do, but is actually probably too simplistic, is you can learn two policies. You can learn a policy about action, you can learn a policy about dialogue, and then you can learn when to do one or the other using simple math tricks, which are not important for the purpose of this talk. You're going to have a synthetic dungeon master. You're going to have a synthetic other players to be able to practice your dialogue and practice your action on there. So these two boxes over here are like, you know, a couple of PhD theses just by themselves. All right, skipping forward a little bit. The last one I really want to talk about, because I think it's the most important, is how do you deal with the lack of ground truth, right? Everything I've talked about before is like, well, something can tell you like this action worked, this action didn't work. Now you don't have anything unless you do something really, really stupid and the dungeon master comes in and says, no, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But most everything you can do, you want to juggle balls, you want to throw knives at dartboards, whatever, are going to be legal. Maybe not useful, but legal. All right. So to do that, we have to ask, can we decouple the game engine from the agent, right? So the game engine is down here at the bottom, providing you observations. Can we just chuck that away? And what happens when we try to chuck it away? Well, we've got to replace it with something. So I'm going to refer back to Lauren Martin's work. She proposed in 2018, well, maybe you don't need that game engine. Maybe you could just feed your own outputs into your knowledge graph. Then your knowledge graph kind of becomes your world state. It becomes your ground truth. Now, this actually and we've explored this in some later work in 2021. This actually works okay. It makes for a good story generator because it's basically a fancier version of autoregression. And when you force things into knowledge graph, it actually kind of reduces the silly things because some things just don't go into graphs particularly well. But it doesn't necessarily prevent you from putting really things that you shouldn't put in there. Things that should be false can still get put into your knowledge graph. Things that should be impossible can still get into your knowledge graph. So you still have to have a way of keeping that from going in here, right? That's why it's a story generator and not a game player. So no ground truth, maybe not a problem. I'm gonna say no problem, but it's actually like, yeah, it's a big problem. But here's the hint. Here's the hint about how we can make progress. What is a simulator but a world model? Okay, so if you're a reinforcement learning person, you know the world model is just the probability of a state given a previous state in action. What this really kind of says is there are certain states that you can get from any other state, but more importantly, other states that you can't get from. It gives you the constraints. So we've been fine-tuning large language models to generate preconditions and effects, because preconditions and effects actually tell you which actions are you allowed to do and which ones you're not allowed to do. Doesn't have to be a single model, it could be multiple models. What we have is one model that says any given sentence about an action, we can say, is this legal to perform? Does it meet the preconditions required from the previous state to be able to change it? And then a second model that says, if it is valid, what will the world actually change like, which you can then turn back into a knowledge graph. But what this is going to do is it's going to constrain the knowledge updates. You're going to say like, no, you can't actually do this. And if you can do this, this is a better idea of how your graph should change. It gives you a better sense of what your legal transitions actually are, or at least what your illegal ones are, which I think ultimately are more important for role-playing games. And then maybe you can actually execute this model as if it's your game engine. So in other words, you can learn your game engine. And my lab has had a lot of experience doing this with video games, and now we're going into text games. This is still hard. This is still something that we have to do a lot of work to actually make sure we understand how to do this correctly. All right. That's what I was expecting to happen. Yep, I'm out. Okay, let me just kind of wrap up. But I think the key takeaway from all this blathering is that a lot of the things we actually just talked about are not just important to games, are not just important to role-playing games, and not just important to Dungeons and Dragons, but are important to lots of things that we want our AI systems to do. And especially in 2023, 2024, as we go into agentic agents, agentic large language models. I see many of you rolling your eyes on that term. We want to do actual agents, right? Let's get the ick out of agents. You like that? I just made that up on the spot. Okay. All right. We want to do planning in language models, right? GPT-01 is starting to do planning-like things, but it's still not particularly grounded in any sort of interesting way. So we are, in fact, by talking about role-playing games, have been talking about planning in language space, as we know is infinite, large, and complicated. We want to deal with open-ended worlds with no ground truth. Well, the real world has ground truth, but we often don't have access to our sensors. So when two people are thinking about like getting together and making a plan together, talking through language, right? They have some vague notion of what ground truth is. It's not necessarily shared, and it is open-ended in the sense that there's lots of possibilities, many more than can be enumerated in any sort of way. the frame of role-playing game gives us this notion of shared experience as a way of getting close enough to grounding to actually do practical things. The real world is often dealing with situations where new goals, new opportunities, new problems arise. We want to be able to solve it. And role-playing games often provide twists and turns, things that are not expected that you have to deal with, new elements, new events, new monsters, new bad guys, new friends, whatever it happens to be coming in. And we have to be able to adapt our language plans, our thought plans in real time to address those. And then ultimately, all of this is really about human AI teaming. It's improvisational, it's on the fly, it's teams of people or teams of people and AI systems as we move forward, working together to solve problems and move together in the real world to make sense. And ultimately, this is about what agents are about in the real world. And this is why playing role-playing games allows us to tackle these hard, fundamental AI hard problems in a fun, interesting, toy-like environment. But not that toy-like, because even these environments are too big and rich for us to be able to solve right now. All right, couple of shout outs here. The two, obviously I've mentioned Laura many, many times here. The other who has been responsible for a lot of the work I talked about was Raj. I mentioned those in particular because you can do silly shit like, oh, is this being recorded? Silly crap like playing role-playing games, texting games, and still get amazing faculty jobs. There's a lot of other people who have been important and incremental to this. And because I'm required to say, one of my students, Sarah Vigrefe, is on the job market. So if you want anyone who does natural language processing, she's your go-to person. Call her up right now. All right, with that, I look forward to hearing your thoughts about all this right now and throughout the day. Thank you very much.